This video is sponsored by the Green Mountain Gaming Grimdark Championship. If you want to play with some of the updates that we're talking about in this video, stay tuned later on for more about them. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and Games Workshop just hit us with a huge balance update to Warhammer 40k a little earlier than we were expecting. This update dropped just this morning on Wednesday, October 16th. What I'm going to be doing today is talk about the factions that I feel were most changed, least changed, and honorable mentions that got both nerfs and buffs in a big way. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single faction in this video. Some factions saw some incredibly minor changes or changes that kind of just balanced out. I'm not going to be discussing those. Instead, we'll talk about the ones that were most impacted. Now, I'm going to be discussing these factions starting with the ones that I feel are the most improved, moving down to the least most improved. And at the top of the list, we have Orcs, which saw enormous points cuts essentially across the entirety of the faction. This included some already widely played units, things like Beast Snagaboys and massive monsters like Kill Rigs, all saw points reductions, meaning that Orc armies are just going to be dramatically larger. On top of that, they also got some beneficial rules updates. Many of their abilities that trigger when the WA is active used to say that they triggered at the time that the WA was declared, which meant in some instances, if you were, for example, in a transport, you wouldn't get affected when the WA was declared, and then you disembarked the transport later on that battle round. Now, all of those abilities have been standardized to remain consistent. As long as the WA is active for your army, you will get those mechanics. So a lot of these abilities have been improved on top of huge points cuts, means that Orcs are going to be looking pretty nice going on into this new season. On top of that, Gene Stealer cults were called out by the design team specifically as being an underperforming faction. And while they have seen some success in the last couple of weeks, they're going to see more because they got ridiculous points cuts across the entire faction. Many of their most played units, this included things like Acolyte Hybrids and Adelan Jackals, saw points decreases, meaning that the average size of a Gene Stealer cult army, which was already taking tons of units, is gonna be even bigger. This is just all upside for these guys. Some of the best units in the codex got points cuts. They're just gonna be larger armies, and that's great for them. Chaos Knights saw a similar thing. That included cuts to widely played units like Warthog Brigands that is gonna be effective for both Chaos Knights and for other Chaos factions that are taking those. And then just means that Chaos Knight armies that are taking a lot of those Wardog units are gonna see an improvement of 35 or 40 points for their faction. That allows you to take an additional enhancement and in some cases an extra utility unit, and is just a huge quality of life change for these Chaos Knights. We're also seeing some changes to their big knights, but whether or not that puts them into the realm of playability is questionable, since the ones that see the most play actually did not get changed. And last, and also maybe least on the big winners section here, is Eldari. If you told me a year ago that Eldar would be one of the most buffed factions in a data slate update, I would have hit you across the mouth for lying to me, because I did not see Eldar buffs coming, but they did get some good ones. This includes points cost reductions on many of their powerful vehicles. Things like Falcons and Wave Serpents are extremely widely played, and having those see points cuts is huge for the army, and they also saw some cuts to some lesser played units. Things like small units of Wraith Blades do see some occasional play. Those did get points cuts as well. Wraith Knights even got points cuts, although without the mechanics that they had at the start of the edition, whether or not they're going to see play is still questionable. And they even got some utility units with a couple points off. Things like Corsair Void Reavers being a cheap scouting unit for the faction now is actually pretty interesting and may put them into the realm of playability in the future. On top of that, the Foot Autarch also got a little bit of a buff as well. This guy was already seeing very minor play as a cheaper alternative to the Autarch Wayleaper, but now he gives his unit rights of battle. He's just copied that ability over from the Space Marine Codex because his normal stratagem duplication effect didn't do anything after the last update. Exciting to see where Eldari goes from here, because I do think that they're well situated to be successful. This video has been sponsored by the Green Mountain Grimdark Championship held at CarnageCon 2024. Carnage Convention is a classic tabletop gaming convention being held the first weekend of November. That's November 2nd and 3rd. This features a wide variety of events, from game-mastered special scenarios for a variety of miniature games, role-playing games, as well as open events like a 5-round Warhammer 40k GT. The Green Mountain Grimdark Championship is a 32-player multiplayer GT, being held in picturesque Hillington, Vermont. It's using all the standard Pariah Nexus missions and terrain layouts you know and love, and awarding prizes from not only Games Workshop and CarnageCon itself, but also Baron of Dice. Running concurrently to the event is also a painting competition, so you can showcase your hobby skills. And speaking as someone who has attended CarnageCon several times in the past, the venue for this event is absolutely nuts. It is being held in a ski resort in the mountains of Vermont, one of the most gorgeous backdrops for some absolutely horrific 40k carnage. And in the off time, you can shop vendors, take a peek at some other games, or just enjoy the incredible scenery. Or obviously enjoy the amenities of the spa as well. Registration for the tournament is available through the CarnageCon website, so you can check in the video description for links on more information and how to register. And thanks again to the Green Mountain Grimdark Championship at CarnageCon for sponsoring this video. And with that, let's move on to some honorable mentions. These are factions that have seen both buffs and nerfs and don't really fit into either category of winners or losers, but still saw some extensive changes. This includes Ultramarines. While Codex Space Marines got hammered pretty hard, with some of their core combos being nerfed, mostly getting caught in the crossfire of other Space Marine chapters overperforming. Things like Dark Angels and Space Wolves that are using core Space Marine rules get those abilities nerfed, and unfortunately that tracks over into regular Space Marines. Ultramarines specifically did see some buffs. This includes a huge point cut to Gilliman, which is probably a full update overdue. He unfortunately lost the ability to duplicate stratagems with his Primarch abilities, because now most things can't duplicate stratagems, and didn't see a points cut that was commensurate with that, which is unfortunate. But he is now pretty cheap for the profile you get and for the stratagem efficiency. We also saw Uriel Ventress wildly also get a huge buff. This guy lost his ability to duplicate stratagems, again for the same reason that Gilliman did, but it replaced it with Lord of Deceit. So he just has a CP tax effect while retaining his incredible deep strike ability, which is huge. If Uriel Ventress was already not in every Ultramarines army that existed, he for sure is going to be now, and alongside a big cut to Gilliman, that's going to be huge. In addition to some other pretty impressive points cuts for Space Marine units, things like suppressors and invader ATVs that can act as pretty good utility units and are now kind of disgustingly cheap. We also saw changes to things like storm speeders to make them more affordable as well, which is all nice for Marine factions. The downside is that, as I mentioned before, a lot of their most common units got nerfed. Jump pack assault intercessors, I think, as everyone expected, did get hit with a points increase. They were disgustingly cheap for the amount of utility and damage that they brought. We also saw eradicators get nerfed, apothecary biologi get nerfed, which has been an instigator for fire discipline combos in Gladius Task Force armies across every single Space Marine chapter. And on top of that, we also saw the fire discipline enhancement nerfed as well. So that specific combo used on most units went up between 20 and 40 points. That's all fairly painful and compounds with nerfs to some of the Codex non-compliant chapters, but is particularly damaging to any Codex compliant Space Marine player that doesn't have any of those non-Codex units to fall back on, especially ones who aren't playing Ultramarines. Tyranids also got some very minor points tweaks. Some units that were probably a little undercosted, things like Lictors did get some points increases, whereas we saw some decreases to some fringe playable units like Von Ryan's Leapers. Carnifexes got a specific points decrease. If you combine it with the small points increase that Old One-Eye gets, it actually means that the total combo of the unit costs a little bit cheaper, which is a nice quality of life change. However, they did get a big nerf to Vanguard Onslaught, their aggressive, stealth-focused detachment. This unfortunately changed one of their core stratagems, the Surprise Assault stratagem, and greatly restricted its targeting. To be fair, it was probably a mistake that it could be targeted as broadly as it did. In the previous version of the stratagem, you could use it at any time during either player's fight phase or during your shooting phase and target anything on the board with it. It didn't require your Vanguard units to be attacking enemies in order to do so. This was a huge outlet for additional battle shock checks and allowed the detachment to battle shock enemies at the end of their own fight phase, or even just pour additional battle shock checks on an enemy in their own shooting phase to give them a greater chance of failing. That made Vanguard Onslaught pretty good at using things like neurolictors that checked whether or not enemies were battle shocked to give you buffs against them. That is going to be way less reliable now, and I think makes the detachment significantly weaker. Necrons got some painful point hits to some of their most played units, especially large things like monoliths and tesseract vaults that we're seeing more play more recently got some big points increases. And we also saw increases to some of their utility units. Units like Deathmarks and single instances of Locust Destroyers also got a points increase, which is generally going to decrease the size of Necron armies. On the flip side, however, they got some points cuts to things like Doomsday Arcs and Triarch Stalkers, which kind of came out of nowhere, and got enormous buffs to the Obeisance Phalanx detachment. This detachment keyed off of Overlord and Triarch units, which tended to be incredibly difficult to source in the faction. However, it's much easier now that they've also added the Noble keyword, which allows more characters to benefit their units with the detachment ability, and they also, finally, have given the Silent King the Triarch keyword. And that gives you a huge shooting platform that can benefit from the detachment ability. On top of the detachment already seeing some fringe play with some powerful stratagems, especially for Necron vehicles, this has the potential to skyrocket the Obeisance Phalanx into the realm of competitive viability. A similar thing has happened to Tau, in fact, which has exchanged some very minor nerfs to highly played units. Things like the Riptide Battlesuit and the Piranha have gotten some minor points increases, but they've traded that for a ridiculously big buff to the Kroot Hunting Pack. Most Kroot units, with the exception of Krootox Riders, which saw a very minor nerf, and Kroot Farstalkers, which didn't see any change at all, went down dramatically in points cost. This includes a 1 point per model cost reduction for Kroot Carnivores, allowing you to save somewhere around 100 to 120 points out of a Kroot Hunting Pack army. On top of that, Kroot characters also went down, and I think have vaulted the Kroot Hunting Pack detachment from a fringe playable meme list into something that could be an incredibly effective horde. On top of Orcs and Genestealer cults also getting huge points cuts across the board and allowing their army sizes to balloon, it's time to get your flamers out because, oh boy, are we going to be running into a horde meta from here on out. Now with that, let's talk about some loser factions. These are factions that got the majority of nerfs across their changes, and this starts with Adeptus Mechanicus. Now Adeptus Mechanicus both saw some points increases and some points cuts. However, the cuts were to some extremely relevant units, especially units that were played very widely across their Skitarii Hunter cohort lists. These are things like Taraxi Sterilizers and Skystalkers that most Hunter cohort lists took in between 3 and 6 units of across those two. Those all saw points increases, and alongside Skitarii Vanguard also getting a points increase that is going to depress the size of a Mechanicus armies slightly. That said, some of their characters did see some relevant decreases, and some units like Cerberus Sulfur Hounds also saw some decreases, so it may balance out, but I do think that many Mechanicus armies will end up being smaller than they were. Astra Militarum did see some very big buffs and reworks to their armies in their Index FAQ. However, also saw some catastrophic points nerfs to many important units. This included units like the Tank Commander, who is ubiquitous across many Militarum builds, and also Bulgrin, which are one of the most controversial units in competitive 40k. An incredible slab of meat that's excellent at both inflicting a little bit of damage in melee, but also absorbing attacks and keeping enemies from engaging a Militarum gunline. Bulgrin were ridiculously efficient for their profile, but one of the few units that the faction had to actually compete in the fight phase. Unfortunately, they've been taken out back behind the shed and shot in the head with a massive points increase, up to 20 points more for a unit of 3 and 40 points more for a unit of 6. About 7 points per model between those two. These guys are ruinously expensive now. That said, those rules updates were a big deal. This includes adding the Squadron keyword to tank commanders. This allows them to receive orders from themselves or other tank commanders, and allows them to benefit from most of the faction's synergies. Things like overlapping fields of fire for +1 AP, or even just the combined regiment's detachment ability, giving them lethal hits against enemy vehicles, is an enormous buff for these units. So while Militarum armies will be dramatically more expensive moving on into the new season, they are going to get a little bit of efficiency, which is why they're relatively high on this list. Dark Angels is the next one. These guys are the recipient of many nerfs from the remainder of the Space Marine factions that we talked about previously. Combos like the Fire Discipline combo and utility units like Jump Pack Assault Intercessors did get a big nerf here, and Dark Angels also saw some nerfs to their most played faction-specific units. This included Azrael and Deathwing Knights, although they did see some points decreases to Ravenwing units, which may increase the playability transferability of those inclusions. That said, the changes to things like Asriel and Deathwing Knights alongside nerfs to the faction as a whole, I think have put Dark Angels a little bit down from where they were previously. That cannot necessarily be said for the next faction we're going to talk about, Black Templars. We did say it was a Horde meta moving into this new season, with a lot of Horde armies getting huge buffs, but the same cannot be said of Black Templars, which got insane nerfs. This included 40-point increases to units like 20 strong Primaris Crusader squads, meaning that the classic mass Crusader Horde armies of yesterday may have gone the way of the dodo, and you may be focused on a much more elite style of army. While they have seen some nerf to some of their non-epic hero characters, both Chaplain Grimaldus and High Marshal Helbrecht also got points increases, meaning that the cost of many of these Horde units has gone up as much as 50 points. And some of the most common Black Templars builds that were playing multiple of these huge Primaris Crusader squads have gone up as many as 200 points. A points increase in line with the nerfs to some of the highest performing factions in the game. Beyond some very good results at the WTC this year, I'm not entirely sure what prompted these nerfs to Black Templars. It might be that Games Workshop just doesn't want to see the mass Primaris Crusader list be effective in the future and want to keep Black Templars as a little bit more of an elite fighting force, but it does mean that that style of Black Templars is much more difficult to play. With Black Templars and with all the other factions we're going to talk about today, it is almost entirely huge points nerfs all the way down the line. Drukhari saw something similar with massive points nerfs to many of their characters as well as many of their most played units. This included things like Incubi, Archons, and Lilith Hesperax, as well as weirdly Drazar. Drazar didn't really see play after the release of Skysplinter Assault, since you don't really need his +1 to wound leadership effect on your Incubi if they're getting Lance from the Skysplinter Assault detachment ability. So the fact that he got nerfed when he wasn't really seeing play anyway is bizarre. But unfortunately, most of the most played character and unit combinations in Drukhari did get hit multiple ways. Incubi getting an increase alongside all of their attachment options, and Archons going up alongside the Court of the Archon that joined into them means that most Drukhari armies are probably going to be looking at paying 100 or more points for most of their builds. This may incentivize Drukhari to play those combinations less, but in a faction without that many datasheets, it is hard to find playable stuff to dive into. There is some unexplored territory in Real Space Raid that we saw doing okay last week, focusing a little bit more on Homunculus Coven stuff, but whether or not that continues to be successful is a big question, and this did feel like a very heavy hit to Drukhari. Thousand Suns, I think everyone could see coming a mile away, huge points nerfs across the board. In some cases, these didn't make a ton of sense, with things like Exalted Sorcerers getting a points increase almost in line with units like Infernal Masters, that were taken in triplicate in most competitive Thousand Suns builds, but for the most part, they made sense. This basically included a 10 to 15 point cost increase to every character in the faction, including a 25 point increase to Magnus the Red. We also saw small increases to units like Mutilith Vortex Beasts, Zangor Enlightened, and 5 model Rubric Marine squads, although, interestingly, we got a points cut on 10 model Rubric Marine squads, hopefully incentivizing players to play them in larger numbers. I don't think you will, because Magnus the Red is still absorbing every single command point ever generated by a Thousand Suns army, even it has new improved points value. So it's difficult to justify taking those larger rubric units, but I appreciate the thought. And with that, let's move on to the most nerfed faction, at least in my opinion, in this October update. This is Adepta Sororitas. These ladies saw enormous points changes basically across the board. Essentially, every component of their most commonly played Bringers of the Flame list got pretty big nerfs. This included nerfs to units like Immolators, Dominion Squads, Castigators, Paragon Warsuits, Morvenval, as well as awkwardly Exorcists, which didn't actually see that much play, but were occasionally played in that detachment. We also saw an enormous cost increase to the Triumph of St. Catherine, this being a largely points-focused update and trying not to change many rules at a base level. This unit wasn't reworked, which is probably what it needs, but its cost was increased by a massive 60 points. For a unit that has the insane force multiplication that the Triumph brings and was played in basically every single Sororitas list ever, this was probably a needed improvement. And to be honest, while this does feel like a heavy-handed change, I don't have too much sympathy for Adepta Sororitas players. I would like to see the codex changed a little bit more than these huge points nerfs handed down, but in the meantime, it's probably what we're going to have to deal with. That said, the faction did see a couple of points cuts. Whether or not they are relevant is going to be the question. Battle Sister squads did get a small points decrease, as well as Zephyrim, which is a nice inclusion. However, we didn't see any changes to units like Penitent units from the Penitent host, and instead saw rules clarification that I think may just permanently kill Penitent penitent host as a detachment. This was rules as written, but I'm not sure it was widely played this way. It was clarified that the penitent host detachment ability must select an ability every single round until it is out of abilities to select. For those who don't know, penitent host has 3 doctrine style abilities it can choose from. Other +3 inches to the movement characteristic of penitent models, +1 to attacks and strength for penitent models when they charge, and a 2+ fight on death from penitent models. These are all pretty powerful abilities, but unlike every other instance of this effect in the game, they must be chosen at the start of the battle round instead of having an option to choose them if you want to. This means that by the end of battle round 3, the detachment rule will have turned off entirely, and a penitent host army will have literally no benefit from them. Again, this was the rule when the codex was released, so this isn't actually a change, but I was actually just unaware that it worked this way, and I think that's the case for a lot of players across the community. So those are my picks for the biggest winners, biggest losers, and honorable mentions for this update. Let me know down in the comment section if you agree and how you feel about the changes to your faction. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to the Green Mountain Gaming Grimdark Championship at CarnageCon for sponsoring this video. Please go check them out in the link in the video description. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.